According to The Guardian, the tech industry is considering abandoning its obligations to combat online misinformation in Australia, claiming that the regulation is too politically charged and contentious. With more people relying on social media for news today, it is quite concerning that we don't know if the information that we're consuming are falsehood or truth. And now with most mainstream media outlets having their own fact-checking departments in-house, we know that there's an increasing need for credible information in both real world and digital world. You're listening to The Divide. My name is Iris Xu. And today we're very lucky to be speaking with the BBC's first dedicated fact-checker, on air and online.
Yes, hello. My name's Chris Morris.
After spending more than 2 decades as a senior foreign correspondent living and working for the BBC in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and the United States, Chris pioneered fact-checking on mainstream BBC news outlets through his development and leadership of BBC Reality Check. And today he runs an independent fact-checking organization called Full Fact.
I'm the chief executive of Full Fact, which is a fact-checking organisation based in London, and we're a charity. And part of our charitable objective is to be impartial. So we don't take one side, and we fact-check all sides of any political debate.
I see. And I know that you were the BBC's first on-air fact-checker.
Yeah, so I've been with Full Fact for nearly 2 years. Before that, I worked for the BBC for a long time, for about 20 years actually. I was a foreign correspondent. I was based in India, in Turkey, in the United States, and in Brussels, covering NATO and the European Union. And then I came back to the UK in 2016, and I set up BBC Reality Check and became the sort of first on-air fact-checker, fact-checking British politics. And then we went, it obviously became the time of the COVID pandemic, so we did a lot on health misinformation. And then, as I say, I left the BBC just nearly 3 years ago now, and joined Full Fact shortly afterwards.
And since then, I think fact-checking has gone mainstream.
It has. I mean, so what was called BBC Reality Check is now BBC Verify, and the BBC's very much put it at the heart of its news output. A lot of the big news agencies now do more fact-checking than they did in the past, so people like Reuters, Agence France Presse. And, you know, I always see fact-checking as part of journalism. It's not a separate thing which has to be bolted on. It's something which should be seen as part of mainstream journalism. I think sometimes the problem is if you separate it off too much, people think, well, aren't all journalists supposed to check their facts? And of course they are. But I think the reason we now have sort of fact-checking as a discipline, separate discipline within journalism, is that there's so much distrust of information because we're bombarded all the time by reams of false and misleading information or AI-generated slop on the internet that people are looking around and wondering what it is that I can trust. And I think a lot of media organisations realise they need to make more effort to say we've really looked into these specific points and trying to present the information in as clear a way as they can.
How was fact-checking during the pandemic?
I mean, it was very weird in one key respect, is that most people at the BBC had to stay at home, but sort of key workers were allowed to travel into the office. So I used to go into the office every day on the train, and I was the only person on the train most of the time. So that was a strange experience. The driver and just me in the train arrive at the station, and obviously there was no public transport, so then walking through a completely deserted London to the office. But it was really important, obviously, because as I'm sure it was everywhere, it was just a very strange time. You know, the global economy locking down, countries shutting down for weeks on end, and more people were turning to media, to fact-checking organisations to try and work out what was going on. There was a lot of misinformation about vaccines. There was quite a lot of misinformation about COVID itself, and so there was a lot of work to do. But it felt like quite a rewarding time because it was a time when, you know, people were kind of scared in a way. What you know, how much worse might this get? Certainly at the beginning, when suddenly COVID spread very rapidly. Thankfully, the vaccines were produced very quickly and helped contain that spread. But it was it's only a few years ago, but we look back on it now. It's a very strange time, I think, all around the globe where everything just ground to a halt.
Yeah, and I think we're still affected by COVID misinformation up until today because a lot of people still refuse to get vaccinated.
They do, and among those spreading that misinformation, I would argue, are the current US Health Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has some pretty strange ideas about vaccination. We have fact-checked him recently, things that he's said which don't stand up to scientific scrutiny as far as we're concerned. Now, people might disagree with us, but the important thing about fact-checking is that we always put our sources in every article we write. So, in effect, you can reverse engineer what we've done. You can see how we've come to our conclusion. We're not asking you to take anything for granted, saying, well, I don't know where you got that information from. There'll be a link to everything. So if you want to work out exactly how we've come to our conclusion, you can do that. And that applies to misinformation about COVID as much as to anything else. And I think that's really important, that people consider that we are as transparent as possible when we are taking on some of these things, which are said quite often by very powerful people.
How has the field changed over the years, and where do you still see the bigger gaps in tackling misinformation?
So I think the main way it's changed is obviously technology and social media. So when Full Fact started in 2009-10, long before I was working there, and when it started, it was really about trying to raise standards in public life, trying to get politicians to correct the records if they said things which were wrong, either by mistake or by design. But then in the subsequent 15 years, obviously, we've had this tsunami of information on social media, and there is so much of it that it's quite difficult to actually make an impact. That's why we believe very strongly in, if you like, tech for good. So ironically, technology has helped supercharge the spread of misinformation. The only way we can really tackle it at an internet scale is to use technology ourselves. So we've built a series of AI tools which don't replace human beings. That's really important. We have a phrase, humans in the loop. So you always keep the humans there because we know that the machines aren't perfect. AI models hallucinate, as they say. They make mistakes. But what they're very good at is going through huge amounts of information and identifying, if you like, the needles in the haystack. But then it's up to human beings to add context, to add caveat, to add the nuance about, is something correct? Is it wrong? Is it missing some context? So it's about, if you like, human intelligence and artificial intelligence working together. And I think that's the big thing that's changed. As technology is changing our world so rapidly, the way it's changing our sector is really quite profound.
I see. And do you ever have to check your media colleagues?
Yeah, we do sometimes. I mean, we don't go out of our way to do it, but if the British newspapers say things which are clearly wrong, if they've got a statistic wrong or something, we will do that and we'll ask for a correction. Because one thing we do, which I think is really important, that a lot of actually bigger fact checkers don't do, and the BBC Verify does not do this. We don't just publish; we publish and then we act. So we go to politicians or we go to media houses and say, we think you've got this wrong. Here's our evidence. Please correct the record. And I think it's really important for politicians in particular, but for newspapers as well, because otherwise, it's if it's a speech in Parliament, a few years ago that speech would have been written up in a book which would have gathered dust on a shelf and no one would ever look at it. It's now all on the internet. Because it's on the internet, that is the information on which the large language models, which are behind things like ChatGPT and Gemini and so forth, all the places where we're all going to be getting most of our information quite soon, all that information is used to train those models. So if you put bad information into the model, you're going to get bad information out at the other end. So it's more important than ever for politicians to take the lead, if you like. We have a phrase that with public office comes public responsibility, and to show that it's correcting the record is not. Politicians hate sometimes admitting mistakes, but actually admitting you've got something wrong and correcting is as far as we're concerned, that's a strength, not a weakness.
I see. And how do they usually respond to Full Fact's corrections?
It varies. Some are very good and some will correct the record. We've had corrections from Prime Minister. We've had corrections from Cabinet Ministers. Others get quite annoyed. Think, well, you're just nitpicking. And we say, well, no, you've got that number wrong. And I think sometimes we are a little bit kind of, we're a bit pushy about it, but I think it's important to maintain the standards. So I think it kind of varies. It's probably more difficult for them to take notice during election campaigns, which is unfortunate because that's probably the most important time. But during election campaigns, politicians go into kind of autopilot mode. We're going to do whatever it takes to win. So at the last UK general election, which was in 2024, there was one specific bit of information from both the main parties, from the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, that had been fact-checked by Full Fact, by others, by the BBC, by newspapers. But it didn't matter that it had been fact-checked. The politicians kept using it. And we used our AI to show that in the week before the election, something which we'd very clearly shown to be wrong was popping up hundreds of times on candidates' Facebook pages and so forth. So that was an unfortunate example of how sometimes it doesn't work. But it's good to call them to account for that, and to say to the people who are going to vote for them whether they've corrected the record or not.
And we know misinformation often flourishes in divided societies. From your experience covering elections or referendums, how does political polarization affect the way fact-checkers reach audiences?
Yeah, it does flourish in divided societies. And, we've had some fairly tumultuous politics in the UK over the last few years, with the referendum on leaving the European Union and then some short-lived governments. But nothing like other places in the world which have been affected by wars, by revolutions. And it's in those, sometimes in the most difficult places in the world, is when fact-checking is most important, because that's when misinformation really can be the difference between life and death. If bad information spreads, falsely accusing somebody of something, it can end in people being killed. So our AI tools have been used in English and French and in Arabic. They've been translated into Arabic now, and been used by quite small organizations in places where there has been conflict, like Yemen, like the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I kind of feel that it's in those places where good information is in such short supply that it's even more important to make sure that fact-checking is done well. In the UK, I think the problem is, I think what we've seen in the United States, actually, is that fact-checkers have kind of got caught in this very partisan debate, and they're either seen as being on one side or the other. I don't know if it's like that a bit in Taiwan. We have tried very hard to say we're impartial, we'll fact-check not just both sides, all sides, but I can feel in Britain too that politics is becoming more partisan, and people like to accuse you more and more strongly of being on one side or the other. I'm happy to say, well, have a look at what we've done, have a look at our record, and we're not biased towards one side or the other. What I think we do, certainly in our politics coverage, is we tend to fact check the government more than the opposition, whoever is in power, because it's the government that actually has the ability to change laws which can affect people's lives. So it's more important, I think, to hold the government to account while making sure that you keep an eye on the opposition parties as well.
So misinformation spreads faster, like you said, today, because of social media and AI. Do you think tech companies are doing enough to curb the problem?
Oh, I could talk for a long time about this. I think for a while they were really making an effort. I think they, in the last 6 months, literally, since the change of the administration in Washington, the tech companies have been pulling away from the fact-checking sector and pulling away from some of their responsibility to do with information integrity. Meta has got a global fact-checking program, but at the beginning of this year it announced it was ending that program in the United States, and it says it intends to end it eventually in other parts of the world. It's replacing it with something called Community Notes, which first appeared on X, Elon Musk's platform, formerly Twitter, and has now just been launched as a Meta platform in the United States, and TikTok has also started something called Footnotes. The trouble with the Community Notes system is, on one level, I think it's good. Anything that tries to get people to talk more politely on the internet is probably not a bad thing, and crowdsourcing is a useful technique. But the way Community Notes works is it's based on what's called a bridging algorithm. And that algorithm will only publish a community note so people can see it when two people who've previously disagreed reach some kind of consensus. So it doesn't matter whether they're factually right or not. It's about finding consensus rather than about establishing factuality. So it's relatively easy for community notes to work on things which are not controversial. If there was a claim on the internet, the Apple Store is giving away free MacBooks this week, we could probably pretty much agree pretty quickly. We go down to the Apple store and find, no, it's not, and we could agree on that. So that community note could be published. But when it's on sensitive stuff like Israel-Gaza or the Russian invasion of Ukraine or elections, it's much harder to reach consensus. So on X, for example, in the 3 days running up to the last US presidential election, virtually all the community notes that were suggested never got published because there was no consensus. Because at critical times, at times of heated political debate, consensus isn't what it's about. And that's where it's important, we believe, to make sure people have access to accurate facts so then they can make their own opinions. I don't really mind what people's opinions are, but I want them to base those opinions and base the sort of heated political debate on a sort of shared body of facts.
So you mentioned how you would respond when critics push back on your findings. Can you tell us more about that?
So we're very open about having a corrections policy. If we get something wrong, we will say so. I mean, we can't ask politicians to correct the record if we're not going to do it ourselves. And, we're all human. Everyone makes mistakes. Sometimes we all make a mistake, and if we do, we will say so. And if we have made a mistake, and then we will make sure on social media we say this is a correction, we got this wrong, here's the correct version. Happily, it doesn't happen that often. It's interesting, the subjects on which we get a lot of pushback. A lot of them sometimes are on those kind of health misinformation issues. People who are vaccine skeptical, or people who are pushing kind of wellness cures, saying, if you rub ginger on your arm, you're going to cure cancer. If you criticize them, they sometimes become very, very hostile. And we just have to deal with that. And sometimes there's abuse, and sometimes we get abuse on social media or by email to our members of staff. And I have a very kind of low bar of tolerance for that. We do have to sort of pursue people sometimes with, legal warnings if they're going to become abusive and actually threatening. It doesn't happen too much, but it has happened. And it's a reminder that cross-journalism and fact-checking, there are places which are a lot more dangerous than the UK. But even in the UK, people seem to feel they have, if they're hiding behind a keyboard, they can make threats that they probably wouldn't make if they met one of our fact checkers in person. And they seem to be enabled to be much more abusive, much more threatening, and it's not acceptable.
So fact checker is actually a very dangerous job.
In some parts of the world, as I say, some of my staff have at times been threatened. In other parts of the world, it's far more dangerous. There are colleagues that we have dealt with and supported who are facing a lot of pressure either from governments or from, I suppose, local businesses who have a kind of a mafia-like sort of presence. So people don't like sometimes fact checkers holding up a mirror to them and exposing the truth.
And do you guys operate in countries under authoritarian regimes?
So we don't operate directly, but sometimes our AI tools are used by other organizations. So our tools are working in some difficult places, but we're not doing the journalism. We're providing the technology and supporting other fact checkers who are working in those countries.
You fact checked everything from Brexit and US elections to the pandemic and climate crisis. What lessons from these experiences do you think matters most right now?
Well, always expect the unexpected. Just when you think the world couldn't get any crazier, it gets a little bit more crazy. A line I use a lot when I'm talking in public is that we are in danger. We're not there yet, but we are in danger of getting to a place where nobody believes anything they read or see or hear anywhere. They just think there's so much stuff I don't trust out there, I'm going to believe nothing. And that's really dangerous. It's really dangerous for democracy, actually, because if people don't have any trust in authority, if they don't have any trust in systems, if they don't have any trust in politics, then there's no consent for people to be governed. And that's when liberal democracy starts to break down. We want people to be skeptical, but we don't want them to be cynical. And I think there is a danger that people become so cynical that even what should be trusted information, what can be shown to be accurate information, people just brush it aside and said, oh, you're lying to me, it's fake news, whatever it may be. And I think that's really dangerous. And I think in politics, in health as a result of the pandemic, climate misinformation is on the rise, certainly in the UK and elsewhere. We need to have the courage to stand up and say that facts matter. You and I can have very different opinions on something, but we should agree on the basic facts of a subject before we have that debate. And we are an impartial charity, but we won't be impartial on the notion that facts matter.
Thank you for listening to The Divide. This episode is produced by Radio Taiwan International.